For 3 years, David Adams had been invisible at Blue Ridge Shooting Sports in Ashford, Virginia. At 72, he was just another face in the morning crowd. Worn jeans, faded flannel shirt, driving a weathered Ford pickup that had seen better decades. He arrived at exactly 6:43 a.m. every Tuesday and Friday, 7 minutes before the range officially opened, fired exactly 30 rounds, and disappeared without fanfare. The younger guys barely noticed him. Why would they? David looked like every other. Retiree trying to stay sharp, moving with the careful deliberation of a man who understood his limitations. His gray hair was trimmed military short under a Navy baseball cap with no insignia, no proclamations. His flannel hung loose over a frame that had once been broader, and his jeans showed the honest wear of a man who still worked with his hands. But there were signs, if anyone had bothered to look, the way he checked corners before entering the building, how his eyes automatically cataloged exits and potential cover positions, the fact that his equipment setup followed a pattern so precise it could have been timed with a stopwatch. Most telling of all was the faded tattoo barely visible on his forearm, anchor and trident that whispered of stories spanning 5 decades. Margaret Wilson, the range owner, had been the only one to really notice David over the years. She'd been a military police officer at Fort Bragg before an IED outside Fallujah ended her service with a Purple Heart and a slight limp. Her trained eye recognized something familiar in David's bearing, but she respected the unspoken rule among veterans. Some stories stayed buried until the right person asked the right questions. "Morning, Dave," she said as he entered, using the name everyone at the range knew him by. "Morning, Margaret. How's your father doing with the new medication?" This exchange was their routine, brief acknowledgement of shared humanity before the business of shooting began. Margaret had learned that David asked about people because he genuinely cared, not because conversation was expected. It was one of the things that set him apart from the weekend warriors who treated the range like their personal therapy session. Michael Rodriguez was already behind the counter, organizing paperwork with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely loved firearms. At 35, he'd been working at Blue Ridge for 4 years, hired away from a Richmond gun shop because Margaret valued competence over charm. "The usual, Mr. Adams?" Michael asked, though he was already pulling David's preferred target from the rack. "Lane 7, if it's available." "Always is at this hour. 25-yard setup?" "That'll do fine." David signed the clipboard with careful script that belonged to a generation that still wrote letters by hand. He carried his own eye and ear protection, though Michael always offered the range equipment. Some habits, Michael had learned, ran deeper than politeness. Lane 7 was at the far end, away from the speakers that would later fill with whatever music the younger crowd preferred. David appreciated the relative quiet, the way sound carried differently in that corner. He set up his gear with movements that spoke of thousands of repetitions. Muscle memory refined over decades. The pistol came out of its case with reverence some men reserved for family heirlooms. It was a customized 1911, not flashy, but immaculately maintained. The grip showed wear in exactly the places where steady hands had held it, and the action moved with smoothness that came from careful attention and quality craftsmanship. David loaded exactly 15 rounds into the first magazine, then set aside the second with 15 more. 30 rounds, no more, no less. It was enough to maintain proficiency without drawing attention, enough to satisfy the part of him that needed to remember without indulging the part that wanted to forget. At 7:15, just as David was settling into his stance, the front door chimed. Noah Fuentes walked in, moving like a man accustomed to being ready for anything. At 28, he had the lean build of someone who ran long distances and lifted heavy things as part of his job. His dark hair was regulation short, and his civilian clothes couldn't quite hide the bearing that marked him as active military. Noah was home in Ashford on brief leave before shipping to San Diego for advanced training. 6 years as a Navy SEAL had given him an eye for recognizing professional competence, and something about the older man in Lane 7 immediately caught his attention. It was the stance that did it first. Textbook perfect, but with subtle modifications that spoke of adaptation beyond standard training. The grip looked solid, elbows positioned correctly, feet planted with the kind of base that suggested formal instruction under stress conditions. When David fired his first shot, Noah noticed the follow-through, the way the man held his sight picture after the round left the barrel. That wasn't casual shooting. That was trained behavior, ingrained through repetition under conditions where accuracy meant survival. Noah set up in lane 5, close enough to observe without being obvious about it. As he prepared his own equipment, he found himself studying David's technique with growing fascination. The older man's reload wasn't just smooth, it was tactical. Magazine changes executed with the weapon positioned to maintain visual contact. Downrange support hand automatically going to spare ammunition. These weren't competition shooting habits. These were combat-developed reflexes. "Excuse me," Noah said during a pause in the shooting. "Mind if I ask where you learned to shoot like that?" David turned slightly, taking in the young man for the first time. He saw the short hair, the way the kid held himself, the careful politeness that marked him as military. More than that, he saw something in the eyes that spoke of recent experience, the kind that came from places where shooting wasn't a hobby. "Here and there," David said. "You serve?" "Navy?" David nodded but didn't elaborate. He turned back to his target and fired his second magazine with the same methodical precision. Each shot was placed with deliberate intent, and Noah found himself studying the technique despite himself. When David finished his 30 rounds, he began the methodical process of cleaning up. Everything was done in a specific order, with attention to detail that spoke of military discipline. "Sir," Noah said, waiting for the older man to finish securing his pistol case, "I couldn't help but notice your form. That's some impressive shooting." David looked at him again, this time with more attention. "You know something about shooting, do you?" "Some. What unit were you with?" For a moment, David didn't answer. He finished zipping his bag and stood slowly, taking the measure of the young man beside him. There was something in the question, something in the way it was asked, that suggested Noah wasn't just making conversation. "Long time ago," David said finally. "Different Navy than yours, I expect." Noah nodded, understanding that some conversations couldn't be rushed. Different world, probably. But some things don't change. "No," David agreed. "Some things don't." They stood there for a moment, two men separated by generations, but connected by something deeper than age or circumstance. Finally, David picked up his bag and walked toward the exit, leaving Noah with more questions than answers and the growing certainty that he'd just met someone whose story was worth knowing. As David's truck pulled out of the parking lot, Noah remained at his shooting bench, processing what he'd witnessed. The man's precision had been extraordinary, but it was the subtle details that intrigued him most. The automatic situational awareness, the tactical reloads, the way David had assessed him before deciding how much to reveal. Noah had met plenty of veterans during his career, but this felt different. This felt like encountering a legend who'd been hiding in plain sight, content to let the world assume he was just another old man trying to stay sharp. The question was, what kind of legend exactly? And more importantly, what would it take to convince David Adams to share whatever secrets he'd been keeping for the past 3 decades? Thursday morning found Noah back at Blue Ridge Shooting Sports, arriving 15 minutes earlier this time. He wanted another chance to observe David's routine, to confirm what his instincts were telling him. The parking lot was empty except for David's pickup truck and Margaret's sedan. Through the front windows, Noah could see David already at the counter, going through his familiar check-in process with the kind of punctuality that spoke of ingrained military discipline. Margaret looked up as Noah entered, noting the deliberate timing of his arrival. In her years running the range, she'd learned to read people, and something about this young sailor's interest in David struck her as more than casual curiosity. "Back again?" she said. "Decided you like our little operation?" "It's a professional setup," Noah replied, then paused, choosing his words carefully. "That gentleman who was here Tuesday morning, he's a regular?" "David, 3 years now, never missed his schedule. Tuesday and Friday mornings, same time, same lane." Margaret studied Noah's face. "Why do you ask?" "Just curious. Impressive technique." Margaret continued to study him. "You're military, aren't you?" "Special operations." The answer hung in the air between them. Margaret had seen enough military personnel over the years to recognize the different breeds. This wasn't some weekend warrior playing soldier. This was someone whose job required a very specific skill set. "Well," she said finally, "David's earned his privacy, but if you're planning to shoot this morning, lane 5 is open again." Noah nodded and headed for his lane, acutely aware that David was already in position at lane 7. This time Noah paid attention to details he'd missed during their first encounter. The way David arranged his equipment spoke of someone who'd operated in environments where misplaced gear could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophe. His spotting scope was positioned at a specific angle, allowing him to observe his target without losing awareness of his surroundings. His spare magazine was placed exactly where his hand would naturally fall during a reload. Even his car keys were positioned consistently, creating a pattern that suggested muscle memory developed under stress. Thomas Bennett arrived at 7:30, a massive man in his 50s whose friends called him Big Tom. He worked construction around Ashford and had been shooting at Blue Ridge since Margaret opened the place. Tom nodded to David in the way of men who respected each other's space, then set up at lane 3. "Morning, David," Tom called out. "Dorothy doing well?" "She's fine, Tom. Thanks for asking. How's that new contract working out?" "Good money, but the commute's killing me. Worth it, though." Noah listened to this exchange while preparing his own gear. David's voice carried the slight softening that came when talking about family, and Noah filed that information away. Married, probably. Long-term, based on the familiarity in his tone. William Carter shuffled in at 7:45, moving with the careful gait of a man whose joints remembered too many years of hard use. At 78, Bill was the range's senior regular, a Vietnam veteran who'd found peace in the precision required for accurate shooting. He claimed lane 4 directly between Tom and Noah and began the slow process of setting up equipment his arthritis made challenging. "Bill," David called out, "need a hand with that target hanger?" "Appreciate it, David." Noah watched David leave his lane to help the older veteran, noting the easy familiarity between them. There was something in their interaction that suggested shared experience, though neither man made any overt reference to military service. When David returned to lane 7, Noah noticed something else. David's reload technique wasn't just fast and smooth, it was tactical. The magazine change was executed with the weapon positioned to maintain visual contact downrange, and his support hand automatically went to his spare ammunition during the process. These weren't competition shooting habits, these were combat-developed reflexes. At 8:15, after David had fired his customary 30 rounds, Noah made his move. He waited until David was cleaning his pistol, then approached with his own weapon unloaded and pointed safely downrange. "Sir, could I ask you about your sight alignment technique? I noticed you're using a modified Weaver stance." David looked up from his cleaning. "You know the Weaver stance? Learned it at Coronado, but your modification is different from what they taught us." "Coronado?" David set down his cleaning rod. "How long have you been a SEAL?" 6 years, just finished. A deployment in Afghanistan, heading back for advanced training." David nodded slowly. "Afghanistan's different from what we dealt with in my day. What theater were you in, sir?" For a long moment, David didn't answer. He finished cleaning the barrel of his pistol, checked the action, then looked directly at Noah. "Southeast Asia, different rules, different war." Noah felt a chill of recognition. "Vietnam?" "Among other places." That phrase carried weight in military circles, suggesting operations that weren't discussed in official histories. Combined with David's age and skill level, it painted a picture that made Noah's pulse quicken. "What unit?" Noah asked quietly. David finished reassembling his pistol and placed it in its case. "Son, some questions are better left unasked." But something in David's tone suggested he wasn't entirely closed to the conversation. There was a quality of assessment in his words, as if he were evaluating Noah's worthiness to hear the answer. Michael Rodriguez had been listening from the counter, pretending to work on inventory while following the conversation between lanes 5 and 7. Something about the dynamic between the two men had caught his attention. The young guy was clearly military, and now it seemed the old-timer was too. but there was something in their exchange that felt different from the usual veteran small talk. Tom Bennett finished his shooting and began packing up, but he lingered near lanes 5 and 7, curious about the conversation. Bill Carter had stopped shooting entirely, though he remained at his bench. "David," Bill said quietly, "this young man seems all right." David looked at Bill, then at Noah. Bill had served with the 173rd Airborne, 2 tours. His judgment carried weight. Noah nodded respectfully to Bill. "Thank you for your service, sir." "Thank you for yours," Bill replied. "Different wars, same job." The moment stretched between them, 3 generations of warriors connected by shared understanding. Finally, David spoke again. "The stance modification you noticed comes from shooting in confined spaces, urban environments where standard technique doesn't work." "Jungle fighting?" Noah asked. Sometimes other places where the official record says no Americans ever served." Noah's training kicked in. He understood operational security, the need for discretion. But he also understood that David was telling him something important, sharing information that carried both trust and responsibility. "I understand, sir. Some operations stay classified forever." David agreed, but the skills don't retire when the man does. Margaret Wilson had been observing from the front desk, noting the shift in atmosphere around lanes 5 and 7. The usual casual friendliness had been replaced by something more intense, more purposeful. She'd seen similar dynamics when former operators recognized each other, the careful dance of mutual identification that preceded deeper conversation. "Noah," she called, using the name from his range registration. "How long are you in town?" 2 weeks leave, ma'am." "Well, David here shoots every Tuesday and Friday morning." Might be worth continuing the conversation. David looked at Margaret with mild surprise. In 3 years, she'd never involved herself in his interactions with other shooters. Her suggestion felt like an endorsement, permission to trust this young SEAL with more than casual conversation. "Margaret's right," David said. "I'll be here Friday if you want to talk shop." Noah nodded. "I'd like that, sir." As they prepared to leave, Tom Bennett approached David. "That boy reminds me of my nephew. Same bearing, same way of looking at things." "Your nephew military?" "Marine Recon. Retired last year after 20. Said it was time to let the young guys take over." David understood the implication. Tom was vouching for Noah in his own way, adding his assessment to the growing consensus that the young SEAL was worthy of trust. William Carter shuffled over to join the conversation. "David, I've been watching you shoot for 3 years. That boy is the first person I've seen who recognized what he was looking at." "What do you mean, Bill?" "I mean, most folks see an old man plinking at targets. That boy sees a professional maintaining his skills." David considered this observation. Bill Carter had survived 2 tours in Vietnam's worst fighting, and his judgment about people carried weight. If Bill thought Noah could be trusted with more information, David was inclined to listen. As they walked toward the parking lot, Noah found himself next to David. The older man moved with purpose despite his age, and Noah noticed he automatically checked corners and maintained awareness of potential cover positions. These weren't conscious behaviors. They were ingrained responses that suggested extensive training in hostile environments. "Sir," Noah said as they reached their vehicles, "I hope I haven't been too forward with my questions." David unlocked his truck door, then turned to face Noah. "Son, in my experience, the right questions asked by the right person at the right time can be the difference between staying hidden and finding purpose again. I'm not sure I understand." "Friday morning," David said. "Come early. I'll show you something that might help with your advanced training." As David drove away, Noah stood in the parking lot, trying to process what had just happened. The conversation had felt like a test, and somehow he'd passed. But passed for what? And what could a retired veteran, no matter how skilled, show a current SEAL that would help with advanced training? Margaret locked up the range, noting Noah's thoughtful expression. "David's a good man," she said. "Whatever he's planning to show you, pay attention. In 8 years of running this place, I've never seen him offer to train anybody." That evening, Noah called his team leader back in San Diego. "Chief, I need to ask you something about record searches." "What kind of records?" "Vietnam era, classified operations." "That's a deep hole, Fuentes. What's got you digging into ancient history?" "Met a guy here in Virginia, former Navy, I think. Something about him doesn't add up to regular service." "How so?" "Skills that don't match. The timeline. Techniques that weren't standard training. The way he talks about places that weren't supposed to have American presence." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Fuentes, you might be stumbling into something above your pay grade. You sure you want to go down this road?" "I think I already am, Chief. This guy offered to help with my advanced training. Nobody makes that offer unless they've got something serious to teach." "All right, but be careful. Some stories stayed buried for good reasons." Friday morning couldn't come soon enough. Friday morning arrived with the kind of pre-dawn clarity that made distant mountains look close enough to touch. Noah reached Blue Ridge Shooting Sports at 6:30, 15 minutes earlier than usual, but David's truck was already in the parking lot. Through the windows, Noah could see two figures inside the building instead of the usual one. Margaret unlocked the door as Noah approached. "David's got company this morning," she said. "His grandson drove down from college." Inside, Noah found David talking quietly with a young man who shared his angular features and steady eyes. The kid looked to be about 19, with the kind of earnest attention that suggested he was absorbing every word his grandfather said. "Robert," David said, "I'd like you to meet Noah Fuentes. He's Navy, like I was." Robert Adams stood and extended his hand with the kind of firm grip that spoke of good upbringing. "Pleasure to meet you, sir. Grandpa said you might be joining us this morning." Noah shook the young man's hand, noting the calluses that suggested outdoor work. "Your grandfather mentioned showing me some techniques. I hope I'm not intruding on family time." "Not at all," David said. "Robert's on fall break from Piedmont Community College studying engineering, but he grew up around firearms. Thought he might benefit from seeing how professionals work." The comment carried weight. David wasn't just introducing his grandson to advanced shooting techniques. He was providing the young man with a window into a world he'd never discussed in detail. Margaret handed Noah his usual target setup, then paused. "David, you planning anything special this morning? I noticed you signed up for lanes 6 and 7. Thought we might need the extra space. Hope that's all right." "Of course. Just curious." As they walked toward the lanes, Noah noticed David carrying 2 range bags instead of his usual one. The second bag was larger, heavier, and bore the kind of wear that suggested decades of use under various conditions. "Grandpa," Robert said quietly, "you sure about this?" David paused at lane 7 and looked at his grandson. "Son, there are things about your family history that deserve to be preserved, not bragged about, not exploited, but remembered by the right people." He turned to Noah. "Your chain of command know you're here?" "I mentioned meeting a veteran who might have training insights. My team leader said to pay attention." "Smart man. What's his background?" 22 years, mostly. West Coast operations. Started as enlisted, worked his way up." David nodded approvingly. "The kind who remembers where he came from. Good." They set up in lanes 6 and 7, with Robert observing from a chair Margaret had provided. David opened his second range bag and withdrew items Noah hadn't expected to see outside of a military facility. The first was a modified 1911 that showed the kind of custom work usually reserved for special operations units. The grips were checkered wood, worn smooth by countless hours of use, and the barrel had been replaced with a match-grade piece that suggested this weapon had been built for precision work under extreme conditions. "Sir," Noah said quietly, "that's not a standard issue piece." "No, it's not. Had it built in 1971 for specific requirements. Barrel length, trigger pull, sight radius, everything was tailored for long-range pistol work in confined spaces." Noah examined the weapon with growing appreciation. The modifications were subtle but significant, representing the kind of specialized equipment that was only issued to personnel with very specific mission requirements. "What kind of range requirements?" Noah asked. 50 to 75 yards. Consistent accuracy under stress. Absolute reliability in adverse conditions." Robert leaned forward in his chair. "Grandpa, I've never seen that pistol before." "It's been in the safe for 30 years. Time seemed right to bring it out." David loaded a magazine with the same methodical care Noah had observed before, but this time there was something different in his posture. The casual, friendly demeanor remained, but underneath it, Noah could sense a shift toward the professional focus that marked serious operators. "What I'm about to show you," David said, "represents techniques that weren't officially taught anywhere. They were developed in the field under conditions where standard training wasn't sufficient." He moved to the firing line at lane 7 and called for a target at 50 yards. Margaret, who had been watching from the counter, came over to observe. In 8 years of running the range, she'd never seen anyone request a 50-yard pistol. Target for serious shooting. David's stance was different now. The casual precision Noah had observed during their previous encounters was replaced by something more intense, more focused. His grip on the pistol was firm but relaxed, his breathing controlled with the kind of discipline that came from operating in life-or-death situations. The first shot rang out with a sharp crack that seemed to carry more authority than the usual range noise. Noah watched the target through his spotting scope and felt his pulse quicken. The bullet hole appeared dead center in the 10 ring. "Jesus," Robert whispered. David fired 4 more rounds in rapid succession, each shot placed with mechanical precision. When he lowered the weapon, Noah counted 5 holes clustered in a group no larger than a silver dollar. "Sir," Noah said, "that's world-class shooting." "It's necessary shooting," David corrected. "When your mission success depends on neutralizing threats at extended pistol range, you develop whatever skills the situation requires." Margaret had moved closer, her experienced eye analyzing what she'd just witnessed. "David, in all the years you've been shooting here, I've never seen anything like that." "Never had reason to demonstrate it before." David reloaded and moved the target to 75 yards. At that distance, most recreational shooters would struggle to hit the paper consistently with a rifle, much less maintain precision groupings with a pistol. "This is where standard training breaks down," David explained to Noah. "At this range, you're not shooting, you're calculating. Wind, elevation, target movement, weapon limitations, everything has to be factored in real time." The second string of fire was even more impressive than the first. 5 shots, 5 hits, all within the center scoring rings. Noah had seen some of the best marksmen in the Navy, but this level of precision with a pistol at 75 yards was extraordinary. Robert was staring at his grandfather with an expression of wonder mixed with something approaching awe. "Grandpa, where did you learn to shoot like that?" David set the pistol down and turned to face his grandson. "Son, there are things about my service that I've never discussed with your grandmother, your father, or anyone else in the family, not because I'm ashamed of them, but because some experiences don't translate well to civilian life." He looked at Noah. "But circumstances change. Maybe it's time some of these skills got passed on to people who might need them." "What kind of circumstances?" Noah asked. "The kind where young warriors are still fighting wars in places where the skills I learned might make the difference between coming home and not coming home." Margaret had been listening with growing understanding. "David, you were special operations, weren't you?" "I was whatever the mission required me to be." The answer was classic military non-denial, the kind of response that confirmed everything, while revealing nothing specific. Noah recognized the technique from his own operational security training. "Sir," Noah said carefully, "would you be willing to share some of these techniques officially? I mean, my unit could benefit from extended range pistol training." David considered the question. "That would depend on several factors. Chain of command approval, security clearances, official sanction. I'm not interested in freelance instruction." "But you'd consider it if those requirements were met?" "I'd consider it." Robert had been listening to this exchange with growing excitement. "Grandpa, does this mean you were like him?" He nodded toward Noah. "Special Forces?" "Different name for it in my day, son. But yes, similar work." "Why didn't you ever tell us?" David sat down on the shooting bench and looked at his grandson, with the patient expression of a man who'd given this question considerable thought. "Robert, when you do work that requires keeping secrets, You get used to keeping them. After a while, the silence becomes more comfortable than the explanations. But we're family. Yes, you are. And family deserves protection from things that might be hard to understand or accept. Noah understood the dynamic. He'd seen it in other operators, the careful compartmentalization that allowed them to function in both military and civilian worlds without contaminating either with the other. "Sir," Noah said, "what changed your mind about sharing this?" David looked at him steadily. "Two things. First, I'm getting old enough to realize that some knowledge dies with the man who carries it unless he passes it on. Second, I met a young professional who seems capable of handling the responsibility that comes with advanced training." Margaret walked back to the counter but remained within earshot. Something significant was happening in lanes 6 and 7, something that went beyond casual instruction or friendly competition. "Grandpa?" Robert said. "Does Grandma know?" "Your grandmother knows I served in Vietnam. She knows I don't talk much about it. She's never pushed for details, and I've never volunteered them." "But she knows you can shoot like this?" David smiled for the first time that morning. "Son, your grandmother has been married to me for 47 years. She knows I can do a lot of things I don't advertise." Noah packed up his gear thoughtfully. The demonstration had answered some questions while raising others. David Adams was clearly far more than a casual veteran, but the exact nature of his service remained mysterious. "Sir," Noah said as they prepared to leave, "would it be appropriate for me to make some inquiries through official channels?" "What kind of inquiries?" "Verification of credentials, background checks, the kind of thing that would be required if we were to pursue formal training opportunities." David considered this. "Son, if you start digging into my background, you're going to find some interesting reading. Are you prepared for that?" "I think so, sir." "Think isn't good enough, because once you open that door, you can't close it again." Noah met David's gaze directly. "I know, sir. I want to open that door." David nodded slowly. "Then do your homework. When you're ready to discuss what you find, we'll talk again." As they walked to the parking lot, Robert fell into step beside his grandfather. "This is going to change things, isn't it?" "Some things, yes, but not the important things. I'm still your grandfather, still the same man who taught you to fish and helped you build that treehouse. But now I know you're also something else." David stopped beside his truck and put a hand on his grandson's shoulder. "Robert, every man is more than one thing. The trick is knowing when to be which thing and with whom." Noah watched this exchange with understanding. He'd had similar conversations with his own family, the careful balancing act between operational security and personal relationships. As David and Robert drove away, Noah remained in the parking lot, processing what he'd witnessed. The shooting demonstration had been impressive enough, but it was the context that made it significant. David Adams wasn't just a skilled marksman, he was someone whose abilities suggested involvement in operations that weren't discussed in official histories. Margaret locked up the range and approached Noah's car. "That was something, wasn't it?" "Yes, ma'am. Something I wasn't expecting." "David's a good man, Noah. Whatever you're thinking about doing, remember that." I will, but I think there's more to this story than any of us realize." "Probably, but David's earned the right to tell it his own way, in his own time." As Noah drove back to his temporary quarters, he was already planning his next move. David had given him permission to investigate, and Noah intended to use every resource available to understand exactly who David Adams really was. The answers he suspected were going to be more interesting than the questions. Noah spent Saturday morning at the Ashford Public Library using their computer terminals to access military databases his security clearance allowed. What he found in the preliminary searches was both illuminating and frustrating. David Adams appeared in Navy personnel records from 1968 to 1998, but most of the details were classified or redacted beyond recognition. The unclassified portions painted the picture of an exemplary career, multiple commendations, advanced training certifications, and a service record that showed deployments to every major conflict zone from Vietnam through the Persian Gulf. But the specific details, unit assignments, mission descriptions, geographical locations, were all marked with classification levels that required special authorization to access. Dorothy Adams was working in her garden when Noah's rental car pulled into the gravel driveway of the small farmhouse 3 miles outside Ashford. She looked up from her tomato plants with the cautious curiosity of someone unaccustomed to unexpected visitors. Noah had wrestled with whether to approach David's wife directly, but something about Friday's demonstration had convinced him that understanding David required understanding the family context that had shaped his silence. "Mrs. Adams? I'm Noah. Fuentes, I've been shooting with your husband at Blue Ridge this week." Dorothy straightened, wiping soil from her hands with a garden towel. At 67, she moved with the energy of someone who'd spent a lifetime managing a household and a farm. Her gray hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her eyes held the steady intelligence that suggested little escaped her notice. "David mentioned meeting a young sailor. Said you were asking good questions." "Yes, ma'am. I hope you don't mind me stopping by. I wanted to speak with you about your husband's service record." Dorothy's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a subtle weariness replacing her initial friendliness. "What about his service record?" "Mrs. Adams, I think your husband may have capabilities that could help current military operations, but understanding his background requires speaking with someone who knows him well." Dorothy set down her gardening tools and gestured toward the porch chairs. "Son, sit down. We need to have a conversation." They settled into wooden rockers that had obviously seen decades of use. Dorothy poured 2 glasses of sweet tea from a pitcher on a small table without asking if Noah wanted any. "Mr. Fuentes, in 47 years of marriage, I've learned that my husband's military service isn't a subject for casual conversation. There are reasons for that." "I understand, ma'am, but I think those reasons might be changing." "Why?" Noah chose his words carefully. "Because the skills he demonstrated Friday represent training that could save lives in current operations, skills that might be lost when he's gone, unless they're passed on." Dorothy sipped her tea thoughtfully. "What did he show you?" "Extended, range pistol shooting that exceeded anything I've seen in 6 years as a SEAL, precision that suggests training far beyond standard military instruction." "And you think this training should be shared?" "If it's appropriate, yes, ma'am." Dorothy rocked slowly, her gaze fixed on the mountains visible beyond their property line. Finally, she spoke again. "Mr. Fuentes, my husband came home from Vietnam, a different man than the one who left. Not broken, not damaged, but changed in ways that took years for me to understand." "How so?" "He was careful about everything. Where he sat in restaurants, how he approached buildings, the way he checked locks and windows before going to bed. And he was quiet about his work in ways that told me not to ask questions." "Did he ever talk about specific operations?" "Never. But sometimes at night, especially in the early years, he'd have dreams. Not nightmares exactly, but dreams where he'd call out names and places I'd never heard him mention during the day." Noah leaned forward slightly. "Do you remember any of those names or places?" Dorothy studied his face for a long moment. "Son, are you asking me to help you investigate my husband without his knowledge?" "No, ma'am. I'm asking if you think he'd benefit from having his service recognized appropriately." "Recognized how?" "Official acknowledgement of his capabilities. Opportunities to train current operators. A chance to contribute to missions that might save American lives." Dorothy stood and walked to the porch railing, looking out over the peaceful farmland that had been her home for 3 decades. "David, retired from active duty when our daughter was born, said he wanted to be present for his family in ways his father never could be. Your daughter? Lieutenant Sarah Adams Miller, Navy nurse, served 2 tours in Iraq before we lost her to an IED in 2009. The information hit Noah like a physical blow. David had lost a daughter in combat, a loss that added another layer of complexity to his relationship with military service. "I'm sorry for your loss, ma'am." "Thank you." Sarah believed in the mission, believed in serving something larger than herself. David was proud of her service, even when it cost us everything. Dorothy returned to her chair, her expression more serious now. "Mr. Fuentes, if my husband's knowledge can help young people like Sarah come home safely, then I support whatever official recognition he's willing to accept. But I won't see him pressured or exploited. He's earned his peace, and any involvement has to be his choice." Monday morning brought unexpected visitors to Blue Ridge Shooting Sports. Margaret arrived to find two men in civilian clothes waiting in the parking lot beside a government sedan. Their bearing and the way they positioned themselves near the building entrance immediately identified them as federal agents. Margaret Wilson? The taller of the two men showed credentials that identified him as Special Agent William Taylor, Naval Criminal Investigative Service. "That's right. What can I do for you?" "We'd like to ask you some questions about one of your range members, David Adams." Margaret's expression became carefully neutral. "What kind of questions?" "Questions about his activities here, his interactions with other shooters, anyone who might have shown unusual interest in his capabilities." "Has David done something wrong?" "No, ma'am. But we understand he's been in contact with active duty Navy personnel, and certain capabilities have been demonstrated that require official inquiry." Margaret unlocked the range door, noting that David's truck wasn't in the parking lot yet. "Gentlemen, David Adams has been a model member here for 3 years. Whatever you think you need to investigate, I hope you'll remember that he's earned respectful treatment." "We understand your concern, ma'am. This is a background verification, not a criminal investigation." Inside the range, the agents set up at a table Margaret normally used for paperwork. Agent Taylor opened a laptop while his partner, Agent Foster, prepared what appeared to be an extensive file. "Mrs. Wilson, what can you tell us about Mr. Adams's shooting abilities?" "He's consistently accurate, professional approach, never any safety violations or inappropriate behavior." "Has he ever demonstrated capabilities beyond normal recreational shooting?" Margaret hesitated. Friday's demonstration had been extraordinary, but she wasn't certain how much she should reveal to federal investigators. "Define beyond normal." "Advanced techniques, military-style training, extended-range precision shooting." "Why are you asking these questions?" Agent Taylor looked up from his laptop. "Ma'am, we've received reports that Mr. Adams may possess specialized skills relevant to current military training requirements. We're here to verify those reports and assess whether formal evaluation is appropriate." At 6:45, David's truck pulled into the parking lot. Through the window, Margaret saw him notice the government sedan and pause before getting out of his vehicle. His body language shifted subtly, the casual demeanor of a man heading to his hobby replaced by something more alert, more tactical. David entered the range and immediately assessed the situation. Two men in suits, federal bearing, positioned to observe and question. His eyes met Margaret's briefly, a silent communication passing between them. "Mr. Adams?" Agent Taylor stood and showed his credentials. "I'm Special Agent Taylor, NCIS. This is Agent Foster. We'd like to speak with you about your recent interactions with Navy personnel." David looked at the agents calmly. "What kind of interactions?" "Your contact with Petty Officer Noah Fuentes, and any training or instruction you may have provided." "Noah's a good young man. What's this about?" "Sir, we understand you demonstrated advanced marksmanship capabilities that suggest specialized military training. We're here to verify your background and assess whether formal military consultation might be appropriate." David set down his range bag and pulled out a chair at Margaret's table. "Gentlemen, if you want to discuss my military background, we're going to need to do this properly." "How so?" "You're going to need authorization levels that allow access to compartmentalized information. You're going to need to understand that some aspects of my service remain classified regardless of how much time has passed. And you're going to need to appreciate that I've spent 30 years maintaining operational security for good reasons." Agent Foster consulted his file. "Sir, we have authorization to review your service record for the purpose of assessing current training applications." "What level authorization?" "Secret clearance with special compartmented intelligence access." David smiled for the first time since entering the building. "Gentlemen, that's not going to be sufficient." Margaret watched this exchange with growing understanding. David wasn't being uncooperative. He was following protocols that apparently required higher security clearances than the agents possessed. "Sir," Agent Taylor said, "perhaps you could provide us with information about your most recent military training and operations." 1998, Naval Special Warfare Development Group cannot provide operational details without proper authorization. The agents exchanged glances. Naval Special Warfare Development Group was the official designation for SEAL Team 6, the Navy's most elite counterterrorism unit. "Mr. Adams," Agent Foster said carefully, "are you claiming to be a former member of DevGru?" "I'm not claiming anything. I'm stating facts that can be verified through appropriate channels by personnel with appropriate clearances." Agent Taylor closed his laptop. "Sir, we may need to continue this conversation with our supervisors present." "That would be appropriate." After the agents left, Margaret and David sat quietly in the empty range. Finally, Margaret spoke. "David, what just happened here?" "Official recognition, Margaret, the kind that changes everything." "Is that good or bad?" David loaded his pistol with the same methodical care he'd shown every morning for 3 years. "That depends on what they want to do with the information they're about to discover." He fired his first shot downrange, the sound echoing in the empty building. But something had changed. The casual precision of a retiree maintaining his skills had been replaced by the focused intensity of an operator preparing for a mission. Margaret realized that whatever was coming next, the quiet mornings of the past 3 years were ending. David Adams was about to step back into a world he'd left behind, and the implications of that transition extended far beyond the walls of Blue Ridge Shooting Sports. Tuesday afternoon brought a phone call that changed everything. David was in his workshop behind the farmhouse, rebuilding a carburetor for his neighbor's tractor, when Dorothy called from the kitchen. "David, there's a Commander Foster on the phone. Says it's official business." David wiped his hands on a shop rag and walked to the house, noting the tension in his wife's voice. Military calls to their home had ended with his retirement, and their return after 30 years felt ominous. "This is David Adams." "Mr. Adams, this is Commander Dorothy Foster, Naval Special Warfare Command. I need to speak with you about a matter of operational importance." David recognized the tone. Official, urgent, but carefully controlled. The kind of voice that preceded mission briefings or crisis responses. "What kind of operational importance?" "Sir, I'm calling regarding reports of training capabilities that may be relevant to current operational requirements. I understand. You've been in contact with Petty Officer Fuentes. Noah's a good sailor. What's this about?" "Mr. Adams, I'm going to be direct. Our investigation into your background has revealed service records that require special handling. I need to meet with you to discuss potential consultation opportunities." David looked out the kitchen window at the peaceful farmland he'd called home for 3 decades. The life he'd built here was deliberately simple, deliberately quiet. But the tone in Commander Foster's voice suggested that simplicity was about to end. "Commander, my service ended in 1998. I'm not looking to return to active involvement." "Sir, I understand your position, but circumstances have developed that make your expertise potentially critical to current operations. Lives may depend on training techniques that you possess." The phrase hit David like a physical blow. Lives may depend. It was the ultimate military argument, the one justification that could override personal preference or comfortable retirement. "What kind of training techniques?" "Extended range precision shooting under adverse conditions, urban environment operations, counterterrorism applications that require capabilities your service record indicates you possess." David was quiet, for a long moment, processing the implications. Commander Foster wasn't fishing for information. She knew exactly what his service record contained, which meant she had access to files that few people in the military were authorized to read. "Commander, discussion of my service record requires face-to-face meeting with appropriate security protocols." "Understood. I can be in Ashford tomorrow morning with a security team and proper documentation. Would that be acceptable?" "Blue Ridge Shooting Sports, ERO 800. Come alone initially. Will assess requirements for additional personnel after initial discussion." Roger that, sir. Thank you. After ending the call, David stood in his kitchen, looking at the phone. Dorothy appeared in the doorway, her expression reflecting the concern he felt. What did they want? To bring me back? Back to what? To who I used to be. That evening, Noah received his own phone call from Commander Foster. She'd tracked him down at the small motel where he was staying during his leave, and her message was straightforward. Petty Officer Fuentes, I need you at Blue Ridge Shooting Sports tomorrow morning at 0800. Your contact with David Adams has initiated an official evaluation that requires your participation. Ma'am, I hope I haven't caused problems for Mr. Adams. On the contrary, Fuentes, you may have identified a resource that could significantly impact operational effectiveness. What kind of documentation? Formal assessment of demonstrated skills, evaluation of training potential, your professional opinion on whether his techniques merit integration into current SEAL training protocols. Noah felt a mix of excitement and apprehension. He'd suspected David's background was significant, but Commander Foster's tone suggested it was more important than he'd imagined. Ma'am, what should I expect tomorrow? Expect to see capabilities that will challenge your understanding of what's possible with conventional weapons. And Fuentes? Yes, ma'am. Everything you observe tomorrow is classified until further notice. Wednesday morning dawned clear and cold, with frost covering the grass around Blue Ridge Shooting Sports. David arrived early and found Margaret already unlocking the building. Big day? She asked, noting the tension in his posture. Could be. We might have some official visitors this morning, the kind that require special arrangements. What kind of special arrangements? The kind that require closed range and absolute privacy. Margaret nodded and flipped the sign on the front. Door to private event, range closed. In 8 years of operation, she'd never closed the range for a private event, but something about David's demeanor suggested this wasn't a normal situation. At 0800 precisely, 2 vehicles pulled into the parking lot. The first was an unmarked sedan carrying Commander Foster and what appeared to be a security specialist. The second was Noah's rental car. Commander Foster was a compact woman in her 50s with graying hair and the kind of steady gaze that suggested extensive command experience. She wore civilian clothes, but her bearing immediately identified her as senior military personnel. Mr. Adams, she said, extending her hand, Commander Dorothy Foster, Naval Special Warfare Command. Thank you for agreeing to this meeting. Commander, this is Margaret Wilson, range owner, and you know Petty Officer Fuentes. Commander Foster shook hands with Margaret and Noah, then turned her attention back to David. Sir, I've reviewed your service record, all of it. The emphasis on all carried weight. David understood that Commander Foster had access to the classified portions of his file, the operations that weren't discussed in official histories. Then you understand why I've maintained privacy about my background. I do. I also understand why that privacy may need to be reconsidered. They moved inside the range where Margaret had arranged chairs around the central table normally used for range administration. Commander Foster opened a briefcase and withdrew several folders marked with security classifications. Mr. Adams, current SEAL training includes extended range pistol instruction, but our maximum effective engagement distance with handguns remains limited. Intelligence suggests our adversaries are developing techniques that exceed our current capabilities. What kind of techniques? Precision shooting at ranges that conventional training considers impractical. Urban environments where rifle deployment isn't feasible, but extended engagement distances are required. David understood the implication. Modern warfare was increasingly taking place in environments where the traditional boundaries between rifle and pistol engagement ranges were blurred. Commander, the techniques you're describing require individual adaptation. They can't be taught in standard curricula. Which is why we need someone with your background to develop training protocols that can be adapted for individual operators. Noah listened to this exchange with growing understanding. Commander Foster wasn't just interested in David's personal capabilities. She wanted him to develop training programs that could enhance the effectiveness of current SEAL teams. Sir, Noah said, would you be willing to demonstrate the techniques you showed me last week? David looked at Commander Foster. This would be for official evaluation? Yes, sir, with the understanding that your cooperation is voluntary and that any training development would be conducted under contract with appropriate compensation and security arrangements. David stood and walked to the range bag he'd brought that morning. Inside was the custom 1911 he'd shown Noah the previous Friday, along with ammunition and targets specifically designed for extended range shooting. Commander, what I'm about to show you represents techniques developed under operational conditions, where failure meant mission compromise or personnel loss. These aren't competition shooting methods, they're combat applications. Understood. David moved to Lane 7 and began setting up his equipment with the methodical precision Noah had observed before. But this time, there was something different in his approach. The casual familiarity of a hobbyist had been replaced by the focused intensity of a professional preparing for a critical mission. "Margaret," David said, "I'm going to need targets at 75 and 100 yards. Margaret paused at the control panel. "David, our insurance doesn't cover pistol shooting beyond 50 yards. Commander Foster spoke up. "Mrs. Wilson, this evaluation is being conducted under federal authority. Liability concerns are covered by military protocols." As the targets moved downrange, Noah felt his pulse quicken. He'd been impressed by David's shooting at 50 and 75 yards, but 100 yards represented a distance where most marksmen would consider pistol accuracy impossible. David loaded his magazine and assumed his firing position. The transformation was complete now. The quiet retiree had been replaced by the focused operator. His breathing slowed, his posture shifted to accommodate the extreme precision required for the upcoming shots. "Commander," David said without turning around, "the record for extended range pistol accuracy was set in 1987 by a DevGru operator during training exercises. 5 shots at 100 yards, group size 4 inches. I'm familiar with that record. It's about to be broken." The first shot echoed through the range with the sharp crack that Noah had learned to associate with David's shooting. Through the spotting scope, he watched a hole appear in the center ring of the target, 100 yards downrange. "Dead center," Noah called. David fired 4 more shots in rapid succession, each one placed with mechanical precision. When he set down the pistol and called for the target to be retrieved, the silence in the range was absolute. The target showed 5 bullet holes clustered in a group no larger than 2 inches, dead center in the scoring rings. David had not only broken the existing record, he'd shattered it by more than 50%. "Sir," Commander Foster said quietly, "how long since you've shot at that level?" "Every Tuesday and Friday for the past 3 years. I just never had reason to demonstrate maximum capability." Noah stared at the target in amazement. "Sir, that's not just record-breaking. That's changing the definition of what's possible. It's maintaining capability that took 30 years to develop. The question is whether it's worth sharing." Commander Foster stood and approached David's shooting position. "Mr. Adams, what would it take to convince you to share these techniques with current operators?" David looked at her steadily. "The assurance that they'll be used to bring young Americans home alive. Nothing else matters. You have that assurance? Then we have things to discuss." By Thursday evening, word of David's demonstration had reached Norfolk Naval Base, Quantico, and Fort Bragg. Commander Foster's initial report had triggered a series of secure communications that rippled through the special operations community like shockwaves. The phrase record-breaking pistol accuracy had a way of capturing attention among professionals who understood the implications of extended-range precision shooting. David spent Thursday afternoon at home, sitting on his back porch with Dorothy, and trying to process the magnitude of what he'd committed to. The peaceful routine of the past 30 years felt like it belonged to someone else now, replaced by the familiar weight of responsibility that came with being needed by the military. "Community. You could still change your mind," Dorothy said, refilling his coffee cup from the thermos she'd brought outside. "Could I, after what I demonstrated yesterday?" "David, you've given enough, more than enough. Nobody could fault you for wanting to keep your retirement." David looked across their property toward the mountains that had provided backdrop to their quiet life together. "Dorothy, when that commander mentioned lives depending on these techniques, I stopped having a choice. I know. It's who you are. It's who you've always been. Are you all right with this? Dorothy reached over and took his hand. I'm proud of you. Scared for you, but proud. Friday morning brought more visitors than Blue Ridge Shooting Sports had ever accommodated. Margaret arrived at 6:30 to find 4 military vehicles in the parking lot and a dozen personnel in civilian clothes waiting near the building entrance. Commander Foster approached Margaret as she unlocked the front door. Mrs. Wilson, I apologize for the crowd. Word about Wednesday's demonstration has generated significant interest. What kind of interest? The kind that includes representatives from multiple special operations units. They want to see David's capabilities for themselves. Inside the range, Margaret found herself hosting what amounted to an informal military convention. SEAL team, leaders, Army Special Forces officers, Marine Force recon personnel, and what appeared to be Delta Force operators had gathered to witness whatever David Adams was about to demonstrate. Master Chief Robert Thompson, a 25-year SEAL veteran, stood near the observation area studying the range setup. At 49, he'd trained more operators than he could count, and he'd come from Little Creek specifically to evaluate David's techniques. Commander Foster, he said quietly, if half of what I've heard is accurate, we're looking at capabilities that could revolutionize close quarters engagement protocols. Sergeant First Class Michael Davis, representing Army Special Forces, was examining the target retrieval system with professional interest. What kind of ranges are we talking about? 100 yards, confirmed accuracy that exceeds existing records by significant margins. Captain Jennifer Watson from Marine Force Recon shook her head. That's not pistol range. That's rifle territory. Not for David Adams. At 0700, David arrived with Noah, who had volunteered to assist with the demonstration. David surveyed the assembled military personnel with the calm assessment of someone accustomed to operating under scrutiny. Commander Foster, David said, this is more people than I expected. Sir, your Wednesday demonstration has generated interest at the highest levels. These representatives are here to evaluate potential integration of your techniques into their training programs. David nodded, understanding the implications. This wasn't just about breaking records anymore. It was about changing the way Special Operations Forces approached extended range engagements. Ladies and gentlemen, David addressed the assembled group. What you're about to observe represents techniques developed over 30 years of operational experience. These aren't theoretical exercises, they're practical applications that saved lives in real-world situations. He moved to his equipment bag and withdrew not just the custom 1911, but also a second pistol that drew immediate attention from the military observers. It was a modified Sig Sauer P226, customized with the same attention to precision that characterized his 1911. 2 different platforms, David explained, optimized for different operational requirements. The 1911 for maximum accuracy, the SIG for rapid engagement sequences. Master Chief Thompson approached David's position. Sir, if I may ask, what operational environments required this level of precision? Urban counterterrorism, maritime, interdiction, any situation where rifle deployment wasn't feasible, but engagement distances exceeded normal pistol parameters. David began setting up at lane 7, but this time he requested multiple target distances, 50, 75, 100, and 125 yards. The final distance drew murmurs from the observers. At 125 yards, conventional wisdom held that pistol accuracy was essentially impossible. Sir, Captain Watson said, are you planning to attempt shots at 125 yards? I'm planning to demonstrate why current training doctrine underestimates what's achievable with proper technique and equipment. As the targets moved downrange, David entered what Noah now recognized as his operational mindset. The friendly retiree disappeared entirely, replaced by a professional whose every movement reflected decades of combat experience. The key to extended-range pistol shooting, David explained to the assembled group, isn't just marksmanship fundamentals. It's understanding ballistics, environmental factors, and human physiology under stress. He loaded the 1911 and assumed his firing position. At 50 yards, standard techniques apply with minor modifications for distance compensation. The first 5 shots produced a group that would have impressed competitive shooters, but David barely paused to acknowledge. At 75 yards, breathing control becomes critical. Trigger manipulation must be absolutely consistent. The second group was tighter than the first, demonstrating accuracy that several of the observers had never seen achieved with a handgun. At 100 yards, David continued, moving to fresh ammunition, everything changes. You're not just shooting, you're calculating. Wind speed, humidity, temperature all become factors in shot placement. The third group shattered the record he'd broken on Wednesday, producing holes clustered in an area no larger than 1.5 inches. The silence among the observers was absolute. Sergeant Davis stepped forward. "Sir, that's not possible with a pistol." "It's not possible with standard training," David corrected. "But special operations require going beyond standard parameters." David switched to the Sig Sauer and loaded a fresh magazine. "Rapid engagement at extended range requires different techniques entirely." He fired 5 shots in succession at the 100-yard target, each shot timed approximately 2 seconds apart. The result was a group only marginally larger than his careful single shots, demonstrating that his accuracy didn't depend on unlimited time for each shot. "Jesus Christ," Master Chief Thompson muttered. "How is that even possible?" 30 years of practice," David replied, "and operational necessity." Finally, David moved to the 125-yard target. The assembled military personnel pressed closer to the observation area, understanding they were about to witness something unprecedented. "At this distance," David said, "conventional wisdom says pistol shooting is impossible. Conventional wisdom is wrong." He fired 5 deliberate shots, taking time between each one to re-establish his sight picture and breathing pattern. When the target was retrieved, it showed 5 hits clustered in the center scoring rings with a group size smaller than many rifles could achieve at the same distance. Captain Watson approached the target with something approaching disbelief. "Sir, this changes everything we understand about close-quarters combat capabilities." Commander Foster was taking notes rapidly, documenting group sizes and techniques. For her official report, "Mr. Adams, how quickly could these techniques be integrated into existing training programs?" "That depends on several factors: individual aptitude, training time allocation, equipment modifications. Not every operator will achieve this level of precision, but most can significantly exceed current capability with proper instruction." Master Chief Thompson studied David's equipment setup with professional interest. "Sir, would you be willing to develop formal training protocols? We're talking about capability enhancement that could save lives in current operational theaters." David looked around the assembled group, seeing the eager anticipation in their faces. These were professionals who understood the implications of what they'd witnessed, people whose job was protecting American lives in dangerous places. "Master Chief, I've been out of active service for 25 years. Modern operations may have requirements I'm not familiar with." "Sir, shooting fundamentals don't change. What you've demonstrated here represents capabilities our current opponents." "Don't expect us to possess." Sergeant Davis nodded agreement. "Sir, in Afghanistan and Iraq, we're facing urban environments where these techniques could provide decisive tactical advantages." David set down his pistol and looked at the targets downrange. 5 different distances, 5 different challenges, all mastered with precision that had clearly impressed some of the military's most experienced operators. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said finally, "if the military wants to develop training programs based on these techniques, I'm willing to participate, but I have conditions." "What conditions?" Commander Foster asked. "First, this isn't about creating super soldiers or unrealistic expectations. These techniques require individual adaptation and extensive practice. Second, any training program must emphasize the fundamental principles that make extended-range accuracy possible, not just the mechanics of shooting." "Understood. What else?" "Third, I want direct involvement in training the instructors. These techniques can't be learned from manuals or videos. They require hands-on instruction from someone who's applied them under operational conditions." Master Chief Thompson extended his hand to David. "Sir, on behalf of the Special Operations community, we accept your conditions. When can we begin?" David shook the Master Chief's hand, feeling the weight of commitment settle around him like a familiar uniform. "Next week, but first I think a formal demonstration is in order, something that documents these capabilities for the official record." "What kind of demonstration?" David smiled, and for the first time since Wednesday, Noah saw a glimpse of anticipation in the older man's eyes, the kind that sets records that will stand for the next 30 years. As the military personnel began filing out of the range, each one stopping to shake David's hand and express appreciation for what they'd witnessed, Margaret realized that Blue Ridge shooting sports had just become famous in circles that most people never knew existed. "David," she said as he packed his equipment, "you know this changes everything, don't you?" "Changes it back," David corrected, "back to what I was always meant to be." Monday morning arrived with the crisp clarity that often preceded significant events. By 0700, Blue Ridge Shooting Sports had been transformed into something resembling a military installation. Security personnel established a perimeter while technical teams set up recording equipment to document what would either be a historic achievement or an expensive failure. David sat in his truck for a moment before entering, watching the controlled chaos of official preparation. Dorothy had insisted on driving him that morning, understanding that today would mark a permanent change in their lives, regardless of the outcome. "You ready for this?" she asked, noting the tension in his posture. "As ready as I can be for something I haven't done in 25 years. What haven't you done?" "Performed under this kind of official scrutiny. When I did this work before, nobody was supposed to know about it." Commander Foster approached the truck as David stepped out. She carried a briefcase that contained the official documentation required for record verification, along with sealed orders that had arrived from Washington over the weekend. "Mr. Adams, sir, everything's prepared for the attempt. Are you comfortable with the setup?" David surveyed the range, noting the precision with which the military personnel had arranged the observation area, recording equipment, and safety protocols. "Looks professional, Commander. What's the official format?" 5 established SEAL marksmanship records, each requiring 5 shots for verification. Independent measurement of group sizes with multiple witnesses from different commands. Everything will be recorded and documented for permanent record. Master Chief Thompson emerged from the range building, his expression reflecting the gravity of what was about to be attempted. "Sir, the measurement equipment is calibrated and ready. We've got representatives from Naval Special Warfare Command, SOCOM, and the Pentagon Special Operations Research Office." David nodded, feeling the familiar weight of professional responsibility settling around him. This wasn't just about breaking records anymore. It was about demonstrating capabilities that could influence military training doctrine for decades. Inside the range, David found an assembly that reflected the significance of the event. Along with the special operations personnel who had witnessed Friday's demonstration, new faces had arrived to observe the official attempt. Dr. Rebecca Thompson, a military historian specializing in special operations evolution, had positioned herself near the observation area with recording equipment designed to capture not just the shooting, but the context that made it historically significant. Captain William Taylor, representing the Pentagon's Training and Doctrine Command, carried sealed evaluation criteria that would determine whether David's techniques merited integration into official military curricula. Noah stood near Lane 7, having been designated as David's spotter for the attempt. The role carried both honor and responsibility. Noah would be calling group measurements and confirming target distances for the official record. "Sir," Noah said as David approached his equipment, "how are you feeling?" "Like I'm about to find out whether 30 years of practice was worth something." David began his preparation ritual, but this time every movement was being recorded and analyzed. The custom ammunition he'd prepared specifically for this attempt represented months of careful load development, with each cartridge optimized for the specific distances and conditions of the record attempt. Commander Foster called for attention from the assembled personnel. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're here to witness an attempt to break 5 Naval Special Warfare marksmanship records. These records have stood for periods ranging from 15 to 35 years, representing the finest shooting achievements in SEAL history." She consulted her documentation. The records being attempted are 50-yard precision group, 75-yard precision group, 100-yard precision group, rapid engagement at 75 yards, and extended range accuracy at 125 yards. Master Chief Thompson activated the recording equipment while Dr. Thompson positioned herself to document the historical context. "Mr. Adams, when you're ready, sir." David loaded his first magazine and moved to the firing line. The transformation that Noah had witnessed multiple times was now visible to the entire assembly. The quiet retiree had been completely replaced by the focused operator. First record attempt, David announced. 50-yard precision group. Current record, 2.7 inches, set in 1989. He assumed his firing position and began the breathing pattern that would carry him through the next hour. The range fell completely silent except for the soft whistle of the ventilation system. The first shot echoed through the building with crisp authority. Through the spotting scope, Noah watched a perfect hole appear in the center of the target, 50 yards downrange. Dead center, Noah called. 4 more shots followed in careful succession, each one placed with mechanical precision. When the target was retrieved and measured under the scrutiny of multiple officials, the result drew murmurs of amazement. 1.4 inches, Master Chief Thompson announced, new record by more than 1 inch. The assembled personnel exchanged glances, understanding. They had just witnessed something extraordinary. Breaking a record by such a significant margin suggested that David's capabilities exceeded even their elevated expectations. Second attempt, David continued without pause. 75-yard precision group, current record, 4.1 inches, set in 1983. The longer distance required subtle adjustments to David's technique, modifications that demonstrated his understanding of ballistics and environmental factors. The 5 shots produced a group that measured 2.6 inches, shattering another record that had stood for over 40 years. Captain Taylor was taking notes rapidly, documenting not just the results but the techniques that made them possible. Sir, your stance modification for increased distance, is that something that can be taught? With proper instruction and sufficient practice time, yes. David reloaded for the third attempt, the one that had generated the most anticipation among the observers. 100-yard precision group, current record, 5.8 inches, set in 1987. At 100 yards, several of the observers moved closer to the spotting scopes, understanding that they were about to witness shooting that pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible with a handgun. The 5 shots seemed to take forever, each one carefully calculated and deliberately executed. When the target was measured, the silence was absolute. 2.1 inches, Noah announced, his voice reflecting his own amazement. Dr. Thompson looked up from her documentation. So that's not just a record, that's redefining what's achievable. It's maintaining capability that special operations require, David replied. Records are just documentation. The fourth attempt tested rapid engagement, skills requiring David to place 5 shots at 75 yards within a 15-second time limit. The current record holder had achieved a group size of 7.4 inches within the time constraint. David's rapid-fire sequence demonstrated the muscle memory developed over decades of operational use. Each shot was fired approximately 3 seconds apart, with barely perceptible pauses for sight realignment. 4.2 inches in 12 seconds, Master Chief Thompson called out, another record broken by significant margin. The final attempt carried the most significance, both for the distance involved and the fact that no official SEAL record existed for accuracy at 125 yards. David would be establishing a baseline that might stand for generations. Extended range accuracy, David announced. 125 yards, 5 shots, precision group. At this distance, even experienced marksmen found it difficult to see their targets clearly with iron sights. David's modified pistol incorporated sight enhancements that provided the precision necessary for such extreme shooting, but the human factors remained the primary challenge. The first shot seemed to hang in the air forever before finding its mark. Through the high-powered spotting scope, Noah could see a clean hit in the center rings of the target. "On target!" he called. 4 more shots followed, each one requiring complete concentration and perfect execution. When the final measurement was completed, the assembled personnel understood they had witnessed something that would be remembered in military circles for decades. 3.7 inches at 125 yards, Commander Foster announced. First official SEAL record at this distance. The silence that followed was broken by spontaneous applause from the military personnel who understood the significance of what they had witnessed. David had not just broken existing records. He had redefined the possibilities of precision shooting with handguns. Master Chief Thompson approached David as he secured his equipment. "Sir, what you've accomplished here today will influence special operations training for the next generation." "Master Chief, what I've accomplished here is documentation of capabilities that existed all along. The question is what the military does with this information." Captain Taylor was reviewing his evaluation criteria, checking boxes that indicated David's demonstration had exceeded every benchmark established for the assessment. "Mr. Adams, on behalf of Training and Doctrine Command, I can confirm that formal integration of your techniques into military curricula has been approved." Dr. Thompson completed her documentation with the satisfaction of someone who had witnessed genuine history. "Sir, this demonstration will be studied and referenced for decades. You've just established shooting standards that may never be equaled." As the military personnel began their departure process, each one stopping to congratulate David and express appreciation for his demonstration, Noah remained at the shooting bench beside his mentor. "Sir," Noah said quietly, "how does it feel to be officially recognized for capabilities you've possessed for 30 years? David looked at the targets that had been carefully preserved as documentation of his achievement. "Son, it feels like finally being able to share something that was meant to help people stay alive. What happens now? Now we get to work training the next generation to exceed what I've accomplished here today." Dorothy appeared at David's side, having watched the entire demonstration from the observation area. "I'm proud of you," she said simply. "Are you all right with what this means for our retirement?" "Dorothy, watching you do what you were born to do, there's no retirement from that." As they walked toward the parking lot, David realized that the quiet years were truly over. But for the first time since his military retirement, that didn't feel like a loss. It felt like coming home to a purpose that had been waiting patiently for his return. The records broken that morning would stand in official documentation, but, more importantly, they would serve as foundation for training programs that could save the lives of young Americans serving in dangerous places around the world. It was, David reflected, exactly what those capabilities had always been intended for. Tuesday evening brought the first indication that David's demonstration had attracted attention beyond military circles. Ellen Richardson, a reporter for the Richmond Times-Dispatch, had received a tip from sources at Norfolk Naval Base about unprecedented marksmanship achievements at a small-town Virginia shooting range. David was splitting firewood behind his farmhouse when Ellen's sedan pulled into the driveway. The afternoon had been quiet, a deliberate attempt to process the magnitude of Monday's events before the military community's response fully materialized. "Mr. Adams?" Ellen approached with the careful respect that suggested she understood she was dealing with someone whose story carried weight. "I'm Ellen Richardson from the Richmond Times-Dispatch. I was hoping to speak with you about your recent achievements at Blue Ridge Shooting Sports." David set down his axe and studied the reporter with the automatic assessment that had become second nature during his operational years. Mid-40s, professional bearing, the kind of measured approach that suggested experience with sensitive subjects. What kind of achievements? The kind that apparently broke multiple military records and has generated significant interest at the Pentagon. Dorothy appeared on the back porch, having heard the unfamiliar voice in their driveway. Her expression reflected the weariness that came with understanding that their privacy was about to become a more complicated issue. "Mrs. Adams," Ellen continued, "I understand your husband's demonstration has attracted attention at the highest levels of military command. Would you be willing to discuss how this development affects your family?" "That depends," Dorothy said, "on whether you're planning to write a story that respects our privacy while acknowledging David's service." "Ma'am, my editor is interested in a human interest piece about a local veteran whose capabilities have earned unprecedented recognition. Nothing sensational, nothing that compromises security." David wiped his hands on a work towel, considering the implications of media attention. Military recognition was one thing, but public awareness brought complications he'd spent decades avoiding. "Ms. Richardson, my military service included classified operations that remain classified regardless of recent developments. Any story would need to respect those boundaries." "I understand, sir. What I'm interested in is the human story How does a quiet retiree living on a small farm end up breaking military records that have stood for decades? The question hung in the air between them. David realized that some version of this story would be told regardless of his cooperation, and his participation might at least ensure accuracy. "Come inside," he said finally. "We'll talk." Wednesday. Morning found Blue Ridge Shooting Sports busier than Margaret had ever imagined possible. The official record documentation had triggered a series of visitors that included military personnel, firearms industry representatives, and what appeared to be federal agents conducting background verification. Michael Rodriguez was barely managing the administrative workload generated by the sudden attention. "Margaret, we've got requests for facility rental from 3 different military commands, 2 documentary film crews, and something called the Small Arms Research Institute." What does Small Arms Research want? They want to study David's equipment modifications and shooting techniques for potential integration into training protocols. Margaret looked around the range that had served the modest needs of Ashford's shooting community for 8 years. The transformation into a center of military attention felt surreal. "Michael, call David and ask him to come in early tomorrow. We need to discuss how this is going to work." At Norfolk Naval Base, Commander Foster was briefing her superiors on the implications of David's demonstration. The secure conference room held personnel whose decisions would determine how the military utilized the capabilities David had revealed. "Gentlemen," Commander Foster addressed the assembled officers, "what we witnessed Monday represents a quantum leap in individual operator capabilities. The question is how we integrate these techniques without disrupting existing training pipelines." Admiral Patricia Hayes, commanding officer of Naval Special Warfare Command, reviewed the documentation with the careful attention that had characterized her 30-year career. "Commander, what's your assessment of Mr. Adams's availability for extended training development?" "Sir, he's committed to participating, but he's made it clear that any involvement must be structured around his personal requirements and family considerations." "What kind of requirements?" "Local training delivery when possible, respect for his privacy, and direct involvement in instructor certification rather than mass instruction." Captain Robert Foster, representing Special Operations Command, leaned forward in his chair. "Commander, the tactical implications of Mr. Adams's capabilities extend beyond SEALs. Army Special Forces, Marine Force Recon, Delta Force, every Special Operations unit could benefit from this training, which raises the question of how we structure delivery without overwhelming him or compromising the quality of instruction." Admiral Hayes made notes in the margin of her briefing documents. "Commander, I want you to develop a proposal for a formal training center located near Ashford, something that allows Mr. Adams to maintain his civilian life while providing the military with access to his expertise." Thursday afternoon brought David's first official training session conducted at Blue Ridge Shooting Sports with a select group of SEAL instructors who would eventually carry his techniques to other operators. Master Chief Thompson had assembled 6 of the Navy's most experienced marksmanship instructors, each one representing years of training expertise and operational experience. They sat in the range's classroom area while David prepared for what amounted to his first military instruction in 25 years. "Gentlemen," David began, "what you learned in your own training represents the foundation for what I'm about to show you. These techniques don't replace fundamental marksmanship. They extend beyond conventional parameters." Petty Officer first. Class Antonio Martinez raised his hand. "Sir, what operational requirements led to the development of these techniques?" "Urban counterterrorism environments where rifle engagement wasn't feasible, but threat distances exceeded normal pistol parameters. Maritime operations where equipment limitations required maximum precision from minimum platforms." David moved to the whiteboard Margaret had installed for the session. "The key insight is that human capability exceeds conventional training limitations when properly developed and maintained." Senior Chief Michael O'Connor, a 15-year instructor veteran, studied David's equipment setup with professional interest. "Sir, how much of this capability depends on customized equipment versus technique modification?" "Equipment enhancements provide approximately 20% improvement. Technique modification provides the remaining 80%. David spent the next 2 hours breaking down the technical elements that made extended-range pistol accuracy possible: breathing control, sight alignment modifications, trigger manipulation, and the mental preparation required for precision shooting under stress. The most critical element, David explained, is understanding that accuracy at these ranges requires treating the pistol like a precision instrument rather than a reactive weapon. When the session moved to live-fire demonstration, each instructor attempted to replicate David's techniques at progressively longer ranges. The results were encouraging. While none achieved David's level of precision immediately, all demonstrated significant improvement over their baseline capabilities. Master Chief Thompson approached David as the session concluded. "Sir, these techniques are learnable. With proper practice time, most of our instructors could achieve 70 to 80% of your demonstrated capability. That's sufficient. For operational requirements, perfect accuracy isn't the goal. Enhanced capability is." Friday evening found David and Dorothy sitting on their front porch, watching the sunset over the Virginia mountains that had provided backdrop to their retirement years. The phone had rung constantly throughout the week with calls from military commands, media organizations, and firearms companies interested in various aspects of David's demonstrated capabilities. "Any regrets?" Dorothy asked, noting the thoughtful expression on her husband's face. "About breaking my silence? No. About the complexity it's adding to our lives? Some. What kind of complexity?" David gestured toward a sedan parked at the end of their driveway, its occupants maintaining discreet surveillance of their property. "Security considerations that weren't necessary when I was just a quiet retiree. Is that permanent? Until the novelty wears off and things settle into a routine. The military doesn't like loose ends, especially when those loose ends involve classified capabilities." Dorothy reached over and took his hand. "David, watching you train those instructors, yesterday you looked happier than you've been in years. I felt useful again. Like the things I learned during all those years of silence were finally worth something beyond personal satisfaction. They were always worth something, now other people get to benefit from them." Saturday morning brought an unexpected visitor, in the form of Robert, David's grandson, who had driven down from college with a carload of engineering textbooks and a laptop computer. "Grandpa," Robert said as he carried his academic materials into the farmhouse, "I've been researching the physics behind extended-range pistol shooting. Your demonstration contradicts everything my ballistics professors have taught about handgun limitations." David looked at the complex equations and trajectory calculations his grandson had developed. "What are your professors saying about the contradiction?" "They're saying it's not possible, that the physics don't support accuracy at the ranges you've demonstrated." "What do you think?" Robert spread his calculations across the kitchen table. "I think my professors don't understand all the variables involved. Human factors, equipment modifications, technique refinements. There are elements in play that standard ballistics models don't account for." Dorothy brought coffee to the table and observed her husband and grandson discussing technical details, with the kind of intensity that suggested Robert had inherited more than just physical resemblance from David. "Robert," David said, "would you be interested in documenting the technical aspects of these techniques, creating mathematical models that explain why they work? Are you serious? The military needs documentation that can be used for training development. Your engineering background could provide the scientific foundation for technique integration." Robert looked at his grandfather with growing excitement. "Grandpa, are you offering me a chance to work on classified military projects?" "I'm offering you a chance to contribute to something that could save lives. The classification level is secondary to the purpose." As Robert began outlining a research proposal that would combine his academic work with his grandfather's military expertise, David realized that the family legacy he'd kept hidden for 30 years was about to become a shared responsibility, spanning generations. The quiet retirement was truly over, but in its place was emerging something that felt like purpose fulfilled rather than privacy lost. The techniques that had once been his alone would now serve a community of warriors, whose missions required every advantage that skill and knowledge could provide. 6 months later, Blue Ridge Shooting Sports had become something Margaret never could have imagined when she first opened the doors 8 years earlier. The modest facility now hosted a steady rotation of military personnel from every branch of special operations, each group arriving to learn techniques that had already begun saving lives in operational theaters around the world. David arrived for his Tuesday morning routine at the same time he had for 3.5 years, but everything else had changed. Lane 7 now bore a brass nameplate reading Adams Training Lane, and the range itself had been designated as an official Department of Defense training facility. Margaret met him at the front door with the same friendly greeting she'd always provided, though her role had evolved from range owner to administrator of what had become known unofficially as the Adams Method training program. "Morning, David. How's the family adjusting to all the attention?" "Better than I expected. Dorothy's enjoying the garden club's sudden interest in military spouses, and Robert's thesis defense is next month. Still planning to use his engineering research on your techniques?" "The Pentagon is funding his graduate work now. Turns out there's significant interest in the mathematical models that explain why these techniques work." Inside the range, David found his usual equipment set up, but this morning he was joined by Master Chief Thompson and a young SEAL operator named Petty Officer 2nd Class Derek Williams. Derek was recently returned from Afghanistan, where he'd successfully employed David's extended range techniques in an urban engagement that had neutralized hostile forces without civilian casualties. "Sir," Derek said as David prepared his equipment, "I wanted to thank you personally. The techniques you taught our instructors made the difference between mission success and potential disaster in Kandahar last month." David looked at the young operator with the satisfaction that came from knowing his knowledge had served its intended purpose. "Petty Officer, what matters is that you and your teammates came home safely. The techniques are just tools." "Tools that saved lives, sir. Multiple, hostile targets at ranges where standard pistol engagement would have been ineffective." Master Chief Thompson had been documenting the operational effectiveness of David's training program, preparing reports that would determine its expansion to other special operations units. "Sir, we've got confirmation of successful technique. Application in 7 different operational theaters over the past 4 months. What kind of success rates?" "Enhanced engagement capability at extended ranges has improved mission effectiveness by 37% in urban environments. More importantly, operator confidence in precision shooting has eliminated several situations where larger weapons might have caused collateral damage." David nodded, understanding that the statistics represented real people in dangerous situations who had benefited from training that extended their capabilities beyond conventional limitations. As Derek began practicing the breathing control exercises that formed the foundation of extended range accuracy, David noticed Noah entering the range in civilian clothes. The young SEAL had been promoted to Petty Officer 1st Class and assigned as David's primary liaison with Naval Special Warfare Command. "Morning, sir. How are you feeling about this afternoon's demonstration?" "Confident. The techniques have been refined through 6 months of instructor feedback, and the equipment modifications are optimized for military production." That afternoon would bring the largest gathering of military personnel Blue Ridge had ever hosted. Representatives from allied nations had requested demonstration of the Adams Method, and the session would determine whether international training partnerships would be established. William Carter shuffled through the front door at his customary time, moving slowly but with the determination that had characterized his approach to life since his Vietnam service. At 78, Bill had become an unofficial historian of the range, documenting the transformation he'd witnessed firsthand. "David," Bill said, settling into his usual chair near the observation area, "you know what this reminds me of?" "What's that, Bill?" "The old days when we developed new tactics in the field, because standard procedures weren't sufficient for the mission requirements." David understood the comparison. The Adams Method represented exactly the kind of innovation that emerged when operational necessity demanded solutions beyond existing doctrine. Dorothy arrived at 1300, driving the sedan that had replaced David's pickup truck when security considerations made his daily routine more complex. She'd adapted to the changes in their lives with the resilience that had sustained her through 47 years of marriage to a man whose work often couldn't be discussed. "How many visitors today?" she asked Margaret, noting the increased activity in the parking lot. 12 different countries, plus representatives from NATO Special Operations Command. David's techniques are apparently generating international interest. At 1400, the official demonstration began with David addressing an audience that included some of the world's most experienced special operations personnel: British SAS, German KSK, Canadian JTF-2, Australian SASR. Each unit had sent their best marksmanship instructors to evaluate training that could enhance their operational capabilities. Ladies and gentlemen, David began, what you're about to observe represents techniques developed through operational necessity and refined through careful analysis of human capability under stress. Colonel James Parker, representing British Special Air Service, leaned forward with professional interest. Mr. Adams, our initial assessment suggests these techniques require individual physical attributes that may limit their general application. Colonel, that's a common misconception. Physical attributes provide approximately 15% of capability enhancement. Mental discipline and proper technique provide the remaining 85%. David moved to Lane 7 and began the demonstration that had become refined through repetition but never routine. Each shot was still calculated, each group still measured, each target still treated with the respect due to a challenge that demanded excellence. The results spoke for themselves. At 50 yards, groups consistently measuring under 2 inches. At 75 yards, precision that exceeded rifle accuracy achieved by many conventional units. At 100 yards, shooting that redefined what Allied forces considered possible with handguns. Lieutenant Colonel Andreas Müller from German Special Forces studied the targets through a spotting scope with obvious amazement. Herr Adams, this accuracy at these ranges, it changes tactical possibilities for close-quarters operations. Lieutenant Colonel, that's exactly the intent. These techniques provide options that didn't exist under conventional training limitations. Captain Sarah Watson from Australian SASR approached David as he completed the demonstration. Sir, what would be required to establish training partnerships that could deliver this instruction to Allied units? Instructor certification, equipment, standardization, and commitment to the fundamental principles that make these techniques effective. Most importantly, understanding that this training requires patience and systematic development. As the international representatives discussed implementation possibilities with Master Chief Thompson and Commander Foster, David found himself standing with Noah near the equipment table where this journey had begun 6 months earlier. Sir, Noah said quietly, when you first agreed to share these techniques, did you anticipate this level of impact? Son, I hoped they might help a few young Americans come home safely. Everything beyond that has been a bonus. The instructors you've trained are now teaching in facilities across 3 continents. Your techniques are being integrated into selection courses and advanced training programs. You've literally changed how special operations forces approach precision shooting. David looked around the range that had become the unofficial center of a training revolution he'd never intended to start. Noah, the techniques were always there. I just happened to be in the right place when someone finally asked the right questions. Robert appeared beside his grandfather, carrying a leather portfolio that contained his completed thesis on the mathematical principles underlying extended-range pistol accuracy. The document had earned him acceptance to a doctoral program, funded by the Department of Defense with research focused on human performance optimization in precision shooting. Grandpa, the university wants to publish my research in the Journal of Applied Ballistics. They're calling it groundbreaking work in human factors engineering. Are you comfortable with that level of academic attention? I'm proud to contribute to something that honors the family legacy while advancing military capability. Dorothy joined the 3 generations of Adams men, her expression reflecting the contentment that came from watching her family find purpose in service to something larger than themselves. David, she said, the Garden Club wants to know if you'd speak at their Veterans Appreciation Dinner next month. What would I talk about? How quiet service often has the greatest impact. How the most important contributions aren't always the most visible ones. As the international demonstration concluded with commitments from 7 allied nations to implement Adams method training, David realized that the knowledge that had been his alone was now serving a global community of warriors whose missions required every advantage that skill and dedication could provide. Margaret approached David as the military personnel began their departure process. "David, I've been thinking about what all this means for Blue Ridge." "What are you thinking, Margaret?" "I'm thinking we should install a memorial wall, something that recognizes the operators who've benefited from training here, the missions that have been enhanced by these techniques. That might be appropriate, but keep it simple. The work speaks for itself." As evening settled over Ashford, Virginia, David and Dorothy drove home to their farmhouse, past the security checkpoint that had become a permanent fixture, past the government vehicles that monitored the approaches to their property, to the peaceful sanctuary they'd created together over 3 decades. They sat on their front porch, as they had thousands of times before, watching the sunset over mountains that had provided constant backdrop to their changing lives. "Any regrets?" Dorothy asked, echoing the question she'd posed 6 months earlier. "About sharing the techniques?" "None." "About the complexity it's brought to our lives?" "Less than I expected." "Why less?" David looked at the lights beginning to appear in Ashford's modest downtown, thinking about the young Americans serving in dangerous places around the world who now possessed capabilities that might bring them home safely. Because it turns out that sharing knowledge doesn't diminish it, it multiplies it. The next morning found David back at Blue Ridge Shooting Sports at his customary time, but Lane 7 was occupied by a young Marine Force recon operator practicing the breathing exercises that formed the foundation of extended range accuracy. David set up at Lane 6, content to serve as mentor rather than the sole practitioner of techniques that were now serving warriors across multiple continents. The quiet man who had broken every SEAL shooting record had become something more valuable than a record holder. He had become a teacher, a legacy creator, a bridge between generations of warriors who understood that excellence in service required constant sharing of knowledge and capability. As David fired his first shot of the day, the sound echoing through a range that had become a center of military innovation, he reflected on the journey that had brought him from classified silence to global recognition. The techniques that had once been his secret were now serving their highest purpose, protecting the lives of young Americans and allied personnel whose missions required every advantage that skill and knowledge could provide. It was, he realized, exactly what those capabilities had always been meant for, and it was exactly where a quiet man from Ashford, Virginia belonged. Not in the spotlight, but in the place where excellence was passed from one generation to the next, where lives were saved through shared knowledge, and where service to something larger than oneself continued long after the uniform was retired. The records he'd broken would eventually be broken by others, but the legacy of service, of knowledge shared for the protection of those who serve, would endure as long as there were warriors who needed every advantage that dedication and expertise could provide. Noah approached David's shooting position as the morning training session concluded. "Sir, there's something I've been meaning to ask you." "What's that, son?" "When you first decided to share these techniques, did you know it would lead to all this?" Noah gestured toward the bustling range, the international training programs, the lives that had been saved. David set down his pistol and looked at the young SEAL who had started it all with a simple question about shooting stance. "Noah, sometimes the most important decisions we make aren't about what we know will happen. They're about being ready. When the right person asks the right question at the right time." "And you were ready?" "Son, I'd been ready for 30 years. I just needed someone to remind me that some knowledge is too valuable to take to the grave." As they walked toward the parking lot together, David realized that the circle was now complete. The skills that had been forged in classified silence were serving their highest purpose. The knowledge was being passed to those who needed it most, and the quiet man from Ashford had found his way back to exactly where he belonged. Service to something larger than himself, helping to bring the next generation of warriors home alive. The morning sun cast long shadows across the range as David and Noah reached their vehicles. In a few hours, another group of operators would arrive for training, another generation would learn techniques that could save their lives, and the legacy would continue to grow. "Same time Thursday, sir?" Noah asked. David smiled, feeling the weight of purpose settle around him like a familiar uniform. "Same time, son. There's always more work to do." As his truck pulled out of the parking lot, David looked in the rear view mirror at Blue Ridge Shooting Sports. the modest range that had become the unlikely center of a training revolution. The quiet years were behind him now, replaced by something far more meaningful. The knowledge that his skills, his experience, and his dedication to excellence were still serving the cause he'd devoted his life to protecting. The old man at the range, who had seemed invisible for 3 years, had finally stepped into the light, not for recognition or glory, but to ensure that the techniques that had once saved his life would now save the lives of countless others. It was, David reflected as he drove home to Dorothy and the farmhouse that remained their sanctuary, exactly the ending his story deserved. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.